A reading from Parashat Lech Lecha, Genesis 12:1 through 17:27. The word of Adonai came to Avram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Avram. I am your shield and shall give you a very great reward. Lord Adonai, Avram replied, what use are your gifts as I am going on my way childless? Since you have given me no offspring, Avram continued, a member of my household will be my heir. Then the word of Adonai came to him in reply, such a one will not be your heir. No, your heir will be the issue of your own body. Then taking him outside, he said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if you can count them. Just so will your descendants be, he told him. Avram put his faith in Adonai, and this was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now be seated for my words. Lech Lecha, get yourself out. This is where we find in our Torah the Abrahamic covenant, the covenants that God made with Abraham. In verse 15:9, where we just read, Avram says to God, well, how am I to know that I will possess all this land? Then Adonai says to him, take for me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So Avram took all these for him. So God says, go get me these animals. And Avram goes and brings him those animals. Fair enough. But that's not all he does. Now God only says, in response to Avram's query, go get me these animals. That's the answer. So he brings the animals, but then he does what strikes me as quite an odd thing. He cuts them all in half, and then he puts them each piece across from its other half. But God hadn't said to do that. Or had he? Avram asked God, how am I supposed to know that this is going to... I mean, you've said it, but how am I going to know this is going to happen? And God says, go get me these animals. And Abraham's response is to cut them in half. Well, what's happening here must be Avram knows why God sent him for the animals. Something we don't know. Something that's part of his culture. That's not part of ours. And that is a blood covenant. They actually call it cutting a covenant for this reason. And what happens is the two men making a covenant will cut an animal, not necessarily in half, but they'll cut so that the blood comes out in a pool. And whatever the promise is, the one person goes through and walks through the blood. And he walks through that blood. And what he's saying is, if it is not as I say, if I do not keep my part of this covenant, you may do this to me. And then the other man walks through the blood. And he's saying, if I do not keep my part of this covenant, you may do this to me. That's the blood covenant. There are still people today who make these covenants. And every once in a while, they'll find a puddle of blood somewhere with footprints all through it. These animals, as we read on in future Torah portions, we find that these same animals are the ones that become the blood atonement sacrifice animals. So there's that aspect. And the rabbis much later, on reflection, look back and see this is the beginning of blood atonement. So not only does Avram get the promise of this inheritance of this land, but his descendants also. Now, as we read on, we find that the sun is beginning to go down. Now, in our translations, it may say at sundown, but there's more than one way to view sundown. In our culture, sundown means when the sun is about at the horizon and we're going to lose it. We aren't going to see it anymore, and we call that sundown. But they also considered an earlier sundown to be when noon is the sun at its highest. Anything after that, the sun is going down because it's at its highest already. So the sun begins to go down at 12:01. So at sundown, we'll figure is around 3 o'clock. And we find that in the rabbinical writings. Well, a strange thing happens at sundown. Not at sunset, but at sun going down in the afternoon. A thick and terrible darkness covers Avram. Now this is actually a Hebrew idiom for extreme terror. One Israeli man was visiting a friend of his in the States, and Israelis are extremely frightened of bears. They are terrified of bears. And this man lived in the woods. And he asked him, "There's not going to be any bears, are there?" He assured him, of course not. Well, in preparing the room that guests normally don't occupy, which was packed with all the stuff that is normally not needed, his wife cleared it all out so that this Israeli guest could share that room. Well, through the course of the visit, he had to get up in the middle of the night, and he wandered to the wrong place where all that stuff went, one of which was a stuffed bear. And there's this horrible scream in the middle of the night, and he comes rushing down, and the man is just white as a sheet because of seeing this bear, and he says, "A thick and terrible darkness covered me." So that's the idiom. Why would Avram possibly be this afraid? Well, think of the gravity of such a covenant. Being cut with El Elyon, the Almighty God. And if he doesn't do something, he's thinking, there's a part, I'm going to have to walk through this blood. And I'll never be able to be good enough or righteous enough. I'll never be able to. I'm sure he's thinking, what's up? What's going to happen to me if I go through this? Well, then, after it was completely dark, a third odd thing happens. A smoking fire pot and a torch of flame pass through the blood. This is a symbol of God's Shekhinah, His divine presence. So that's God going through. If I do not, because Avram had asked him, how do I know for sure that this is really going to happen? God's presence passes through the blood path, saying, if I do not, you may do this to me. Well, in the Mosaic covenant, which is added on to this, we find God requiring a morning and an evening sacrifice. Every morning. Every evening. Every morning, 9 in the morning. Every evening, 3 in the evening. The sacrifices. And by the time of the temple in Herod's day, this had developed into quite a service. The priest would march up to the pater, the wing of the temple, and stand at a certain spot, ready for the exact moment of 9. And then he would raise that shofar and blow the blast, announcing to everyone in the city, morning sacrifice now. Stop what you're doing. Reflect. And at 3 p.m., same thing. The priest would go up to this spot. And they've actually found this stone. Being at the high place in the temple, it was one of the first ones to fall when the Romans destroyed the temple. And they finally got down to it and found it, and it's inscribed there, the place where the priest stands for the blowing of the shofar. 3 o'clock. The blast comes out, so all in the city know it's the time of the evening sacrifice. Pause and reflect. So come with me to that time. Yeshua outside the city. The people had not been righteous, but God certainly had been. But there was a funny thing with that Abrahamic covenant. Avram didn't walk through the blood. Only God walked through the blood. There was the smoking fire pot. That's God's presence, the pillar of smoke. So then it's Avram's turn. But God says, no. And a flaming torch. Again, God's divine presence walks through the blood. As if God is saying, if I am not faithful, you may do this to me. But he is also saying, if you are not faithful, you can still do this to me. In the temple, 9 a.m. on one certain day, the priest goes up to the stone, ready, and at 9 a.m., and not far from there, and then we're told in Matthew, now from noon until 3, total darkness came over all the land. A thick and terrible darkness, I dare say. And at 3, the time of the evening sacrifice, the priest goes up, Yeshua the rabbi, as any good rabbi, desires to die with the words of Psalm 22 on their mouth. A psalm which speaks of dividing and gambling for your clothing. A psalm which talks about God supposedly caring so much for an individual. Well, let God save him then, if he cares so much for him. A psalm which speaks of thirst. My mouth is dry as a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. What did Yeshua say? I thirst. A psalm that begins with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? A psalm which ends with the words, all who prosper on earth will bow before him. All who go down to the dust will do reverence before him. All those who are dead, their descendants will serve him, will proclaim his name to generations still to come. And these will tell of his saving justice to a people yet unborn, for he has finished it. It is finished! What is finished? What began way back in our Parsha with Abraham. How can I know? Well, he could know.